This deal is another example of our two governments working together to rebuild our economy.
Premier Ford has been an outstanding partner, as evidenced by all the success we've had.
Welcome back to Question Period. As we were just talking about with the Japanese ambassador, Honda is now planning to build a $15 billion EV supply chain here in Canada, giving provincial and federal politicians the chance to set aside their differences and announce the new plants in Ontario side by side. While the Prime Minister was all smiles at that announcement on Thursday, earlier in the week he took aim at Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre after Poilievre was photographed meeting with anti-carbon tax protesters who had set up camp at the Nova Scotia-New Brunswick border. Trudeau flags present at the camp and a diagolon symbol on one of the structures. Trudeau also threw shade at Poilievre for the endorsement of infamous American conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, who said Poilievre is, quote, saying the same things as me.
Every politician has to make choices about what kind of leader they want to be. Are they the kind of leader that is going to exacerbate divisions, fears, and polarization in our country, make personal attacks, and welcome the support of conspiracy theorists and extremists? Because that's exactly what Pierre Poilievre continues to do.
In response, a statement from Poilievre's office says the opposition leader, quote, made a brief and impromptu stop, and in reference to Alex Jones goes on to say that, quote, unlike Justin Trudeau, we're not paying attention to what some American is saying. Our Sunday strategy session is here to unpack all of this week's hot topics. Kathleen Monk is a former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Kory Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody. Happy Sunday. Good to see you. Scott, I'll start with you on the subject of Honda. We have talked in previous weeks about some of the tiffs around the carbon tax. They were long gone. Everyone's saying what a great job everyone else is doing. What kind of political impact do you think both of these governments think this type of announcement has for them?
Well, I think it's really interesting from the federal government perspective because they know that by showing up and partnering with the Ontario government, they can then rely on Doug Ford and Vic Fedeli, the economic development minister, to sell this deal. I mean, they go all in on this approach. This idea of industrial strategy by way of attracting investment, spending dollars, and committing to tax credits. This is the Ontario way, and the federal government is happy to hook its wagon to it and to echo it. And what's the interesting thing politically is you've got federal conservatives, the cousins of Doug Ford and Vic Fedeli, immediately out with a press release being critical, saying, oh, you know, it's all going to be a scheme to hire temporary foreign workers. Their lack of enthusiasm for this approach, for the industrial strategy that's being pursued by the Ford government and the federal government is obvious. And so the clear question on them you have to ask is, will there be a federal partner should Pierre Poilievre become prime minister? And how can Doug Ford show up at rallies 12, 13, 14, 15 months from now holding Pierre Poilievre's arm in the air if Poilievre is going to undermine Doug Ford's fundamental critical core economic policy? It's a real puzzling collision on a federal provincial basis.
It is interesting, Kory. I would say, like, the Conservatives have raised concerns that other stakeholders have raised as well about, for example, the guarantees linked in the contracts, because we don't have any eyes on them right now as for how many Canadian jobs there'll be, and that kind of thing. But they also, to Scott's point, haven't said explicitly we'd reverse this, we would keep it. They haven't really espoused an explicit policy. They just raise these questions, which leads, I think, to the kinds of questions that Scott is raising. What do you think about how that might play out?
Well, I think it's very, very, very unlikely that the Conservatives will ultimately oppose these agreements, given the number of jobs at stake and given where they are in the country. Like, this is big-time swing seat territory, and the seats that any government needs to win if they want to form a majority government. So I think it's extremely unlikely that at the end of the day the Conservatives would oppose this. That said, it is not an approach that is popular with a lot of Conservatives in terms of providing corporate subsidies. There's some discomfort in parts of the Conservative coalition around that. but they tend to be more like the Andrew Coyne, Sean Spear kind of pointy head types, as opposed to the actual voters that they're actually seeking right now, which are a little bit more of a steel-toe boots and lunch buckets crowd. And those are the people who will ultimately be working in these plants, and the communities that they live in will be the ones benefiting the greatest from the reindustrialization of southwestern Ontario.
Scott brings up, I think, an interesting point about who this potentially resonates with. Like, what is the strategy? I mean, I understand the sort of industrial strategy that they're aiming for, but like, who does this resonate with? Is it the people who will be employed by these plants in all these vote-rich areas? Like, it's definitely probably not the person living in Fort McMurray in Alberta.
Yeah, right,
but,
for sure. But
they're
there's
not
a long
voting for them
history.
anyway.
There's a really long history of politicians delivering jobs to secure votes, right? So that happens all the time, and that's what this is. I think that the interesting thing is the kind of almost how puzzling the photo op is, because you see Prime Minister Trudeau, Minister Freeland alongside, as Scott and Kory just said, Premier Ford and Minister Bethan Foley, Minister Fideli,
umpteenth
right?
time, though.
For the umpteenth time, right? But they're doing that cozy relationship is so interesting because they do have a voter coalition in Ontario, right? There are these Trudeau Ford voters that are very much aligned. And so it is really interesting, as Scott mentioned, the fact that, you know, the Conservatives so strongly, not Pierre Poilievre himself, but certainly his team and his spokesman came out so strongly against the deal yesterday. And so I think that's...
But they're not strong. I don't think they're... I think
Oh,
they're...
but
they didn't say we're not going to keep it.
No, they didn't say we're not going to keep them, but they basically challenged the idea of this deal going forward. And Mr. Ford, Premier Ford, excuse me, was really strong in how he responded. He said, either you support these investments or you are saying you do not have confidence in Ontarians. And that was a bit of a throwdown for him to be that strong. And I think that, you know, listen, I think that when you have these massive investments like this, there has to be tied to good jobs, respect for workers, the ability to unionize. But we could also go further. If we're worried about, you know, corporate welfare, why not actually write in some policies that actually limit corporate executive compensation? That could be done, and that might ease off, because we're going to be investing $93 billion over 10 years. We should actually make sure that that money's just not going into the corporate executives, but actually creating the communities and the workers and jobs that we want in our communities.
Okay, switching gears really quickly, I want to just get one comment from each of you on this week, as I said in the introduction, the stop at the Nova Scotia border from the Conservative leader, and the response from the Conservatives to the slagging kind of that move by the Prime Minister. What did you think of how that unfolded?
I thought it was really peculiar. I don't know why Mr. Poilievre stopped. You know, I don't think he would stop on the side of the road if there was a strike or a picket line. I don't think he would stop on the road if there was another kind of protest, if there was a climate or peace or otherwise. So I think it was an error, and I think that it would be a real mistake for him to think that the voters that are now considering the Conservatives, that have moved over from Liberal, New Democrat, Bloc, Green, whomever, who are now moving to the Conservatives in terms of the public opinion polling, they are not locked in. And it is days like this, moments like this, that will amp the risk up in potentially securing that vote. So I think it was a mistake, and I think that ultimately if the Liberals are able to amplify it or use it in some way, it's going to be damaging.
Scott, I heard from a lot of Conservatives this week who said, like, they did not believe it was a political vulnerability at this point because of how far ahead Poilievre is versus Trudeau and other leaders. I take Kathleen's point about those votes not being locked in, but that appears to be the perception among them right now.
Yeah, I don't know if this kind of behavior is going to cause him a problem between now and the next election, but it will eventually stick to him. And it's a little bit like the last issue in the sense that he doesn't think he needs Doug Ford's support because he's so far in the polls. He doesn't think he's going to pay a penalty for hauling the car over and chatting with these guys with the diagolon symbols because he thinks he's so far ahead in the polls. But I keep hearing from people, from Conservatives, well, you know, when Trudeau goes off, it's just a strategy. And when we decline to talk about Alex Jones, well, that's strategic. We're refusing to take the bait. We're not going to get into the trap. I don't think it's strategic. I think it's a choice. I think that they're comfortable with this kind of opinion, and I think they're comfortable with this kind of coalition. And so I think Pierre Poilievre isn't acting out of strategy. He's just going where he wants to, and he's doing what he wants to. And I don't know why, for the life of me. He wouldn't lose a single vote if he stood up on camera tomorrow and said, Alex Jones is repugnant. I don't want my name in his mouth. I want nothing to do with him. He wouldn't lose a single vote. And he won't do it, not because that's a good strategy or bad strategy, because he doesn't want to.
Kory, what do you think about that? Is it a political calculation he's making, or is it a sort of value choice, as Scott alludes to?
It's a political calculation. Look, this notion of going after leaders because they had a picture taken with someone in a photo line, or, we've seen that play out for every party at one point or another over time. I think it's a distraction.
He drove into the meeting and he drove in, stopped.
Sure,
It wasn't,
yeah,
whoops,
but
caught you in a
we're talking
line.
about two different things here. We can talk about the Alex Jones piece, or we can talk about going and meeting with people who are protesting the carbon tax. I don't think there's any political downside in going and meeting with people who are protesting the carbon tax. And that doesn't mean that you have to agree with every sentiment or every sign that you're going to see somewhere. But those people are overwhelmingly supportive, not only of Poilievre, but of the main plank in his election platform right now, which is to get rid of the carbon tax. And speaking to groups of people who share that view is not a problem. You know why? Because we're probably 80% of Canadians now who share that same view. It's not a radical position to say you're opposed to the carbon tax. It's in fact the most mainstream position you can hold in Canada today.
I guess my only question, just to quickly follow up for you, would be, because it's such a broad swath of the population, I totally agree with that assessment. Are there not groups of people you can, support that view and talk with who don't also have F. Trudeau flags or symbols of dialogue?
But the people who are the most energized around any issue, whether it was free trade in the 80s, or whether opposing it, or whether it's opposing a carbon tax now, the people who are out protesting and doing things like that are the most likely to actually turn up and pound in signs and knock on doors for you and write a check for $100 to your campaign. There is a reason why the Conservatives are out fundraising the Liberals 10-1 right now. And it's because they actually have an activist base that they spend some time talking to, who are actually willing to write checks and to volunteer for them. And so, this is the Liberals trying to drag the Conservatives down into the abyss that they exist in right now when it comes to not having an activist base. The Conservatives have one. They should be unapologetic about it. I would be looking for the next opportunity to go and talk to folks like that, because that is ultimately going to help fuel your campaign.
You have definitely not convinced your
No.
colleague Scott.
Stand under an F. Trudeau flag for $100. That's a hell of a prime minister.
Okay.
Well, a lot of Canadians agree with that flag, unfortunately, for Trudeau.
But there might be other ways to say it. Okay, I got to leave it there. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for a great discussion. Appreciate it. Kathleen Monk, Kory, Teneycke, and Scott Reid, our Sunday strategy session.